The vastness of space stretched infinitely around the spaceship Zalora, a shimmering vessel that bore the distinctive geometric patterns of Kurlaxian engineering. The ship, a marvel of technology, had glided through the emptiness like a silent predator for years, completing one high-risk mission after another. Its crew, the elite of the Kurlaxian race, were chosen for their unparalleled expertise in advanced mechanics and engineering, their knowledge prized throughout the Galactic Federation. But in that particular moment, none of that seemed to matter. A sudden collision with a rogue asteroid had left the Zalora drifting, its main propulsion system disabled, and auxiliary power diminishing by the second. The metallic groaning of the ship echoed through the narrow corridors, vibrations trembling beneath the feet of the anxious crew members. The main bridge, usually a well-oiled machine of calm calculations and precise coordination, was now a chaos of blinking warning lights, frantic voices, and the sounds of systems shutting down one by one. "This shouldn't be happening," shouted Chief Engineer Varin, his many-fingered hands frantically tapping at the console in front of him. His deep violet skin, a mark of the Kurlaxian engineering caste, seemed to darken with a mix of stress and disbelief. "We're losing stabilizers on Deck 3. Power levels are critical." "Bring up the auxiliary matrix," Captain Rull barked, his tentacle-like appendages swaying under the weight of authority. His voice, deep and commanding, seemed to barely mask his worry. The captain had guided Zalora through countless missions, and this was not the first time the ship had encountered danger. But this situation was unlike any they had faced before because their beloved ship was hurt, truly hurt, and nothing in their vast database seemed to provide a way out. The asteroid had struck the ship's rear, ripping through critical circuits and damaging the main engine manifold. As it broke apart, fragments had embedded themselves in other sensitive systems, causing cascading failures throughout the ship. Even the communication systems were faltering, leaving Zalora isolated from potential rescue. The Kurlaxian engineers, each a specialist in various facets of space mechanics, gathered in the engineering bay, their faces a mix of determination and thinly veiled panic. Screens flashed chaotic data, the normally orderly flow of numbers and schematics now a bewildering mass of red alerts. "Divert power from the lower decks," Varin instructed, his voice tense as he pulled up a holographic image of the ship. His gaze darted over the diagram, trying to locate a possible solution. "The connections are fried," Engineer Rika shouted back, her eyes widening in disbelief as she scanned the circuits. "We're down to emergency backups, and even they won't last more than an hour if we don't stabilize the core." The room fell silent for a moment, a silence heavy with the weight of their dire situation. It was a silence broken only by the irregular beeping of a nearby console, signaling yet another system failure. Every Kurlaxian in the room knew what was coming without power to stabilize the core. A full shutdown was imminent, and then the vacuum of space would become their final resting place. In the midst of this unfolding catastrophe, standing at the back of the engineering bay, Alex quietly observed the scene. He was not a member of the elite engineering caste, nor was he a specialist. He was human and outsider, whose presence on the Zalora was viewed by most of the crew with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Despite the Kurlaxians' advanced capabilities, they had agreed to an experimental exchange program between species, and Alex had been chosen to join their crew due to his mechanical expertise on Earth. To most of the Kurlaxians, Earth was a Deathworld, a term reserved for planets that were too dangerous, too unpredictable for comfortable habitation. Its gravity was harsh compared to the low-grav environments they were used to, its climate erratic, its fauna aggressive. They saw humans as tough, primitive, and slightly reckless creatures. While Alex had earned a place among them, he often felt the weight of their skepticism. But as the engineers struggled and voices rose in agitation, Alex felt something else, a determination that had carried him through countless challenges before. He took a step forward, pushing through the cluster of frantic aliens. His work boots made a dull thud against the metal flooring, catching the attention of those around him. "What do you think you're doing, human?" Varen snapped, not bothering to hide his annoyance. The stress had stripped away any formality, and his usually composed demeanor was fraying at the edges. "Let me take a look," Alex said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. He moved closer to the console, scanning the damage reports as they flickered across the screen. His eyes narrowed as he analyzed the schematics, his mind piecing together a plan even as more alerts flashed in angry red. "Look," Engineer Rika's voice was incredulous. "Our systems are far beyond your level of understanding. This is advanced Kurlaxian engineering, not some terrestrial mechanism you can patch up with a wrench." Alex didn't flinch. He understood their doubts. Humans weren't known for their technical finesse compared to Kurlaxians. But Alex had something else, an instinct honed by a lifetime on a planet where adaptability was a survival trait. He turned to Varen, his eyes unwavering. "You need a solution, and I think I can give you one," he said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. He pointed to the ship's exterior display. "The asteroid hit has damaged the primary conduits, but the secondary systems can still be patched manually. We don't need to rely on automated tools. We can reroute power through bypass circuits if we do it directly." Varen stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He looked back at the holographic image of the ship, then at the console in front of him, his fingers twitching slightly as he considered Alex's words. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing towards the schematics. "Show me," he said, his tone a mix of challenge and desperation. Alex nodded and stepped forward. He quickly accessed the interface, fingers moving with practiced ease. He pulled up a series of diagrams, highlighting sections of the ship's power grid. The Kurlaxians watched, their expressions skeptical but intrigued. "We need to access the maintenance shafts in Section 4, Alex said, pointing to a spot on the diagram. "The main conduits are damaged, but we can reroute power through these lines here." He highlighted a secondary route if we bridge the gaps manually. "Manually?" Rika repeated, her eyes widening. "That would require exposure to the ship's exterior." "The radiation levels I know," Alex interrupted, his gaze steady. "It's dangerous. But if we don't do this, we're out of options." A tense silence fell over the room. The Kurlaxians exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. Finally, Captain Rel spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "Do it," he said. "If this human thinks he can save us, let him try." The engineering bay burst into action. The Kurlaxians moved quickly, gathering the necessary tools and equipment. Alex suited up in an exterior maintenance suit, the heavy fabric pressing against his skin as he adjusted the helmet. The suit was designed for Kurlaxian physiology, and it felt cumbersome, but Alex ignored the discomfort. The maintenance shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. Alex moved carefully, his gloved hands gripping the rungs of the ladder as he descended. The shaft was dimly lit, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's systems and the distant vibrations of the damaged engine. As he reached the bottom, Alex activated his helmet light, the beam cutting through the darkness. He could see the damaged conduits, the metal twisted and scorched from the impact. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he moved closer. The radiation levels were high, and Alex could feel the heat seeping through the suit. He worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision as he disconnected the damaged lines and began rerouting the power. The conduits were heavy, the metal cold against his gloves as he maneuvered them into place. The Kurlaxians watched from the engineering bay, their eyes glued to the monitor displaying Alex's progress. Varen's fingers tapped nervously against the console, his gaze flicking between the screen and the power levels. "Radiation levels are rising," Rika said, her voice tense. "He won't be able to stay down there much longer." Varen didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the screen. He watched as Alex connected the final conduit, the power levels stabilizing as the ship's systems came back online. "He did it," Varen whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. In the maintenance shaft, Alex let out a sigh of relief as the power flowed through the conduits, the ship's systems humming to life around him. He climbed back up the ladder, his muscles aching from the effort. As he reached the top, he was met by the wide-eyed stares of the Kurlaxian engineers. Varin stepped forward, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply stared at Alex, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, to Alex's surprise, he extended one of his many-fingered hands. "Good work, human," he said, his voice filled with reluctant admiration. Alex took the offered hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. He knew he still had a long way to go to earn their full respect, but this was a step towards proving that even a primitive Deathworlder could make a difference. The initial shock of seeing Alex pull off the impossible began to fade, and the engineering bay gradually fell into a determined silence. The engineers, who had just witnessed something they considered beyond the capabilities of a mere human, now turned their attention back to the task at hand. Yes, Alex had brought the power back online, and yes, the ship was no longer drifting helplessly through space, but the work was far from over. The damage to the Zalora was extensive, and if they were going to survive, they needed to stabilize the engine and make more comprehensive repairs. The tension was palpable as Captain Rel stood at the center of the bay, observing the scene. His tentacles shifted restlessly as he monitored the flickering displays, his gaze periodically flicking to the human who had just climbed back into the engineering bay, visibly exhausted but with an unmistakable determination still in his eyes. Alex removed his helmet, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. His muscles ached, his back stiff from the strain of crawling through the maintenance shaft, but he didn't have the luxury to rest. He could see the exhausted faces of the Kurlaxian engineers, their wide eyes still betraying their disbelief at what he had managed to accomplish. He knew that they couldn't afford to be complacent, not now, not with the ship still barely functional. Chief Engineer Varin, who had just a short while ago dismissed Alex's abilities, now looked at him differently. He approached, his multiple eyes narrowing slightly, as if still trying to comprehend what had just happened. Despite the skepticism that remained, there was a newfound respect, however begrudging, in his demeanor. "You managed to stabilize the auxiliary power," Varin said, his voice grudging but containing a hint of admiration. "But the main engine is still critical. If we don't stabilize it soon, everything you just did will be for nothing." Alex nodded. He was well aware of the ship's condition. The power rerouting was a temporary solution, a patchwork fix to buy them time. But what they needed now was something more substantial, a plan to truly stabilize the ship's systems and prevent any further cascading failures. He moved to one of the consoles, gesturing to Varin to pull up the schematic of the main engine room. The holographic image flickered to life in the air above the console, showing a detailed diagram of the ship's power and propulsion systems. Alex studied it for a moment, his eyes tracing the lines of conduits and power nodes. "Here," Alex said, pointing to a section of the engine that was highlighted in red, indicating damage. "The primary manifold is still compromised, and that's putting a strain on the entire propulsion system. If we can reroute the load to the secondary cores and isolate the damaged section, we should be able to stabilize the output long enough to make a more permanent repair." Varin tilted his head slightly, considering the suggestion. His eyes flicked to the other engineers in the room, who were now watching Alex with a mixture of hope and doubt. They knew that the primary manifold was one of the most critical components of the entire ship. It was designed to handle immense loads, and without it, they were operating at a fraction of their capacity. "That's risky," Engineer Rika interjected, stepping closer. Her gaze was sharp, her voice tinged with concern. "If we divert too much power to the secondary cores, we could risk overloading them. If they fail, we're done for." Alex turned to her, nodding. "I know. But if we don't do this, the primary manifold will continue to deteriorate, and we'll lose propulsion entirely. We don't have a lot of good options here. The secondary cores can handle the load if we reinforce the connections and manually control the output." Captain Rel, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "Do it. We've come this far. I trust you will not let us down, human." The crew sprang into action once more. There was no time to waste. Each second that ticked by was another second closer to the entire ship losing stability. Varen began issuing orders, directing the engineers to gather reinforcement materials and tools. Rika, still somewhat skeptical, moved alongside Alex, watching as he began preparing the sequence for diverting the power. The engineering bay was a whirlwind of movement. Tools clattered, and voices echoed through the metal-walled chamber. Alex stood at the center of it all, his eyes darting between the console and the engineers around him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the heavy burden of being the one who had to once again prove himself capable. "Rika," Alex called, motioning her over to one of the control panels. "I need you to monitor the load distribution. We're going to be operating close to the maximum threshold, and any fluctuations could be dangerous. If you see any instability, you need to let me know immediately." Rika nodded, her eyes narrowing with focus. She might have doubted Alex, but now, seeing his determination and how he had already saved them once, she was willing to trust his judgment, at least for now. The plan was straightforward, but far from simple. Alex needed to bypass the damaged manifold, reroute power through the secondary conduits, and ensure that the increased load didn't overwhelm the system. It would require precise timing and coordination. One wrong move, and they could end up making the situation worse. Alex moved to the power distribution board, his fingers flying across the controls. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his senses heightened by the urgency of the moment. The console beeped as he initiated the sequence, the lights above flickering as the ship adjusted to the new power flow. "Stabilizing." "Now," Alex muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The graph displayed the power levels, the lines spiking and dipping as the ship adjusted to the new configuration. He could feel the eyes of the Kurlaxian engineers on him, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. For a moment, everything seemed to be working. The power levels began to stabilize, the readings on the console evening out as the secondary cores took on the load. Alex allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. But then, the alarms began to blare. "Power spike in Core 3, Rika shouted, her eyes widening as she stared at the monitor. "The load's too high, it's going to blow." Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had expected fluctuations, but not this. He moved quickly, his fingers flying across the controls as he tried to reroute the excess power. The console beeped in protest, the red warning lights flashing angrily. "Come on. Come on." Alex muttered under his breath, his focus unbreakable. He could feel the tension in the room, the fear radiating from the Kurlaxians as they watched the power levels spike dangerously. "Core 3 is at critical levels." Rika's voice was strained, her hands hovering over the controls as she waited for Alex's next move. "We need to relieve the pressure, or it's going to overload." Alex's mind raced. They needed to divert the power, but there were limited options. He scanned the schematic, his eyes darting over the different systems. There it was risky, but it might just work. "Divert the excess to the coolant system," Alex said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "It's not designed to handle this kind of load, but it'll buy us time." Rika hesitated for a split second, then nodded. She moved to the control panel, her fingers tapping out the sequence. The ship shuddered as the power was diverted, the lights flickering as the system adjusted. The alarms continued to blare, but the power levels began to drop, the spike leveling out as the coolant system absorbed the excess energy. "Power levels stabilizing," Rika reported, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and relief. She turned to Alex, her eyes wide. It worked. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but he forced himself to stay focused. They weren't out of the woods yet, there was still work to be done. "Good job," Alex said, nodding to Rika. He turned back to the main console, his eyes scanning the readings. The power levels were stable, but the system was still fragile. They needed to reinforce the connections, make sure that the temporary fix would hold until they could perform a full repair. The next few hours were a blur of movement and coordination. Alex worked side by side with the Kurlaxian engineers, directing them as they reinforced the conduits, rerouted power lines, and stabilized the engine. The ship continued to shudder periodically, the damage from the asteroid impact still affecting its stability, but slowly, steadily, they were making progress. As the hours passed, Alex could feel the exhaustion beginning to catch up with him. His muscles ached, his eyes burned from staring at the screens, but he pushed through the fatigue. He could see the same exhaustion on the faces of the Kurlaxian engineers, their movements sluggish as they worked, but none of them were willing to give up, not now, not when they were so close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last conduit was reinforced, the final power line secured. Alex stood back, his eyes scanning the readings on the console. The power levels were stable, the engine output steady. The ship was no longer in immediate danger. A cheer went up from the engineering bay, the tension that had gripped the crew finally breaking. Alex allowed himself a small smile, his shoulders sagging with relief. They had done it, they had saved the Zalora. Captain Rell approached, his tentacles swaying as he regarded Alex. There was a look in his eyes that Alex hadn't seen before: respect, and perhaps even a hint of gratitude. "You've proven yourself today, human," Rell said, his deep voice resonating through the bay. "The Zalora and her crew owe you a great debt." Alex nodded, a tired smile on his face. "Just doing my job, Captain." Varin stepped forward, his many eyes regarding Alex with a newfound sense of admiration. "I underestimated you, human. Your methods may be unconventional, but you've shown us that there's more to engineering than just advanced technology. You've shown us resilience." Alex looked around at the faces of the Kurlaxian engineers, their expressions now filled with respect instead of skepticism. He knew that he had earned their trust not through words, but through action. He had shown them what a human was capable of, and in doing so, had become a part of their crew. The ship still needed repairs, and there was much work to be done before they could continue their journey. But for now they had survived, and for Alex that was enough. As the crew began to disperse, returning to their stations to assess the remaining damage, Alex leaned against the console, allowing himself a moment to catch his breath. He looked out at the vastness of space beyond the bay's viewport, the stars twinkling in the distance. He had come a long way from Earth, from the world that the Kurlaxians called a Deathworld, and though he still had much to prove, he knew that he had taken the first step towards earning his place among them. The Zalora was safe, for now, and as long as he was aboard, Alex knew he would do whatever it took to protect the ship and its crew, because that was what humans did. They adapted, they survived, and they fought for the people who stood beside them.